Thank you very much, Francesco. And I have just started my chronometer so that I remain within 25 minutes at the latest for this presentation. So thank you also for asking me to reason to a bit with you about this very stimulating and fascinating topic that is actually quite at the center of my research at the moment. I will start with a spoiler by saying that the specific role for AI-based techniques in the analysis of the impact of culture, I will refer to, although at the end of as you will see, of reasoning that I think gives the right framework for this, is already almost fully deployed in two papers that I co-authored in 2011, 2012, and then I will make available to the organization for if anybody is interested in digging deeper into them, that were used to analyze in particular one dimension of the impact of culture, in this case on psychological well-being. And for that particular case, we made use of a battery of AI-based techniques that I will detail at the end of my presentation. But there you really find a very simple, user-friendly way to understand how they are used. So even if given the short time that we have for the presentation, I will not project slides because it would have taken too much time to explain in detail. But you will have, if you want, some specific case studies in which the applications that I'm discussing will be absolutely available and hopefully understandable. To start from, the ideal starting point to discuss this issue, though, is not artificial intelligence, but it's the impact of culture itself. And to do this, we have to briefly connect to what we are learning today about the most recent neuroscience research as it comes to what is actually the role of culture that it's today being understood as fundamental, pivotal, I would say, in determining crucial aspects of human individual and social behavior that basically is the channel through which the impact on culture, the impact of culture materializes. So the first point that we have to stress is that what is being today increasingly learned from the neuroscientific point of view is that the very function of human brain is not about thinking or about reasoning, as we are accustomed to think, to be convinced of, but is very much about regulating bodily functions, which is not a surprise. But the point is that the crucial dimension, and as we will see, that's really important for us in the cultural perspective, but the crucial dimension of the functioning of the brain has nothing to do directly with thinking or with the imagination in itself, but has to do with the capacity of the brain to regulate the accessibility and the optimal management of all the resources that basically keep a body, of living body, alive. This particular process is called allostasis because it doesn't do simply with optimally regulating a body to reach an optimal position and to stay there, but this state is dynamically evolving all the time. Of course, we are changing all the time, and so the task of the brain is not to regulate, simply to, like, for example, a heater system would to reach the optimal temperature in a room, but is much more complicated and has to do with the dynamic allocation of resources to an ever-evolving state depending on the interaction with the environment. The consequence of this is that if the brain has this main task, the crucial dimension for the brain is to be predictive. Because think, for example, of what it means to allocate, let's say, sugar or salt or the availability of certain types of neurotransmitters in a certain moment to, for example, boost the energy if you have, let's say, to run away from a predator. In this particular case, you have to forecast what will be the environmental conditions in which this boost will be necessary and to secure that the resources are available at the right moment. For this reason, the brain has been designed evolutionarily as a prediction machine. And prediction from this point of view really means anticipating the likely states in which you will find yourself. In an allostatic perspective, every activity that is expensive from the point of view of material resources, like, for example, let's say, sugar or anything that gives you energy, or the chemical regulators and so on and so forth, any kind of activity that is expensive needs to have some sort of evolutionary rationale. So one could ask, what is the rationale of culture? Because in the end, think, for example, let's say, or singing or dancing. These activities are activities which are extremely expensive. Because if, for example, you have to run all the day, for example, let's put ourselves in the Paleolithic condition in which our regulation systems were basically set as they are today. In this particular context, I mean, running, when you have to run all the time, let's say to chase potential game, or for example, to escape predators, it's not particularly wise. I mean, to consume your energies, let's say, to dance or sing or to do these kind of things. So why should we have evolved a reason for, let's say, considering culture such a vital activity and such an energy consuming activity that would have been worthwhile? What we are learning from our predictive brain perspective today is that culture has indeed a crucial function. Because first of all, what we are learning is that the capacity of the brain to predict is absolutely and crucially linked to a sort of mental model of the world that you design that makes certain types of events likely to happen or less likely to happen. And it's not simply a matter of statistical estimation. This mental model of the world is mostly a cultural model. So the point is that the capacity of the brain to predict what's going to happen has to do a lot with the cultural constructs that we develop to create, let's say, the top-down probability model on the basis of which we predict events. And the role of culture from this point of view is apparent, of course, in the forms that historically it has assumed, for example, under the guise of religion, but more generally today, think, for example, of how we represent ourselves in terms of human nature, how important it is, for example, for social cognition, what kind of, for example, literary or theatrical images that we have, or cinematic images that we have today of what is the nature of humans to our actual capacity to predict how other humans are behaving in a certain circumstance. In particular, there is also another aspect. Prediction is very much about simulation. So you have to simulate conditions. And in particular, whenever you are surprised, and of course, the task of the brain from this point of view is to minimize surprise in the long term. So you don't want to find yourself in situations in which your brain was not able, for example, to predict that you needed a certain type of nutrients at a certain moment, and this could, for example, endanger your life because you're not able to run or to jump or to whatever. So from this point of view, minimizing surprise in the long term means that the brain has to enhance its prediction abilities in the short term, and simulating possible conditions in which you are not able to predict correctly what happens. If you think of lots of different types of human forms of culture, you see that the evolutionary rationale behind them is very often improving dramatically our predictive capacity. And I'm not saying that this is instrumental to prediction. We have intrinsic reasons to do this, of course, but the really interesting point is that what is meaningful to us is generally cast in predictive terms. Think of listening to music. What happens when you listen to music? Your brain constantly predicts what is the future unfolding, let's say the close unfolding of the melody or the harmony as you listen. And your capacity to be attentive and to be engaged is crucially linked to the mismatch between what you actually hear and what you predict to hear. If you hear exactly what you predict, you get bored very easily. If you keep on being surprised, and this can happen also with melodies or music that you heard hundreds and hundreds of times if this is complex enough, then of course you get engaged and you remain engaged and you get lots of pleasure about that. Or think, for example, of what happens in terms of stories. What is the human craving for stories? Human craving for stories has many different components, but one of the aspects that we are particularly engaged with is what? If there is a storyline that is particularly engaging for us, we can't wait to learn how it ends, where it goes. So exactly the point is that our brain forms a certain type of prediction on the unfolding of the story, and this prediction can be falsified or not. But in any case, we learn a lot, and we get a lot of pleasure out of it because we are rewarded by our brain, by the fact that we are trying to learn how a specific storyline unfolds. So from this point of view, it's extremely important to understand that in terms of the human cognitive, and we will see in a moment, the emotional constituency, cultural experiences are absolutely fundamental. So speaking about or reasoning about the impact of culture so far has been seen as a sort of instrumental line of reasoning, like, okay, we need to justify why we want to give money to the theater, so we have to find a way to convince people that this has an impact on the social level. But from what we are learning, this is absolutely, gratuitous in the sense that clearly there are these sorts of social impacts, but the role of culture is much more fundamental, and in some sense can be considered as a cornerstone of any reasonable understanding of human behavior in all circumstances. So if we have been accustomed to think, for example, of culture as a form of self-expression that sits at the top of this imaginary Maslow pyramid that, by the way, Maslow never dreamed of creating, but so this idea that culture is in some sense something that arrives at the end in the sphere of human actualization, spiritual actualization. Once all the basic needs have been solved, what we are learning increasingly quickly is that culture is very much about our capacity to address the most basic needs that humans have. And from this point of view, this is of course not only going to revolutionize how for example, impact studies are done, but especially what is our understanding of the cognitive and emotional and behavioral impacts of culture. So if we have to understand what kind of framework we can devise to analyze this particular impacts, the impacts of culture when seen from this, let's say, intrinsic perspective, where we really root culture into the neurobehavioral foundations of human experience, what kind of framework do we need? Well, there are quite a few important dimensions that we have to consider. One I have already spoken about, and it's the dimension that distinguishing between the cognitive sphere, the emotional sphere, and the behavioral spheres. There are basically the three spheres that today inform social behavioral science. Then there is another aspect that we have learned is particularly important in evaluating the impact, which is the active versus passive dimension of cultural experience. In certain cases, we are engaged to create content ourselves, active forms of participation. In other contexts, we are passive. We are watching something happening or listening to, or of course, synesthetically using all our sensory organs to perceive what's happening, for example, on a stage. But in this case, it's the passive form of engagement. And for example, from the point of view of impact, the distinction active-passive is important. Another very important distinction is that between stimulation and modulation. We can have situations in which we are aroused by a cultural experience. Again, in terms of music, think of something like, let's say, a march, or something that invites you, let's say, to move or to take action or to dance. In other cases, music has a very, very important role of, for example, emotional modulation. Think of a lullaby, which is the most obvious case in the case of modulating, for example, the mood of newly born children. But more generally, you know of so many occasions in which music can act as an extremely powerful modulator of your own mood. For example, we know today that it's basically one of the most powerful ways to modulate mood, or for example, to diminish the feeling of physical pain, for example, in post-surgical context, listening to music. It's in many cases a soother, a very powerful soother of physical pain in this circumstance. Yet another dimension is that between the individual and the social. And that doesn't need any further explanation. And yet another one is the distinction between the hedonic and the eudaimonic dimension. So there are situations in which the cultural experience is purely for pleasure, is really very much about having fun and releasing stress and so on and so forth. In other circumstances, culture is more about making you think of, let's say, your human condition, or what's your place in the world, what's your relationship to other humans. And in this particular case, it's not simply releasing stress. Sometimes it can be quite the contrary, even engaging you in ways that stress you emotionally, but in certain forms that you find particularly meaningful and engaging. So the problem is that if we want to devise a full-fledged paradigm for cultural impact, we have to cross all those dimensions. So, for example, you can have a dimension of impact in culture in which you consider the emotional side of active participation for mood modulation at the social scale for eudaimonic purposes. And that's just one dimension of the many that we are considering. So when we consider the impact of culture, we cannot simply say yes or no. Today, we can be more and more specific, more and more accurate in terms of what kind of impact are we talking about. And so in particular, what kind of indicators, what kind of scales, what kind of tools you can use to measure accurately what happens in this particular sphere. So what is the role of AI in all this? As you easily understand, what I'm saying is that the number of different variables that are involved in this particular form of assessment is very high. And using traditional statistical technology, statistical methodologies, it's very difficult to arrive at a powerful inference in this particular regard. What you need to learn, for example, in this case, is what specific variables in a large collection of variables are particularly important in terms of, let's say, closeness of their conversation in determining a certain type, for example, of emotional impact of a certain experience, knowing that in principle, you could really consider a very large number of these variables. So traditional statistical methods don't work very well, and in particular, don't give you much insight. At most, they can simply say, okay, this is, for example, as association, this variable has a statistically significant impact, but you really don't see what is the overall map, the overall relationship between the various variables. But there are today AI-based methods, and in particular, one specific AI architecture called AutoCM that has been developed in Italy, by the way, at the Semeion Research Center in Rome now more than 15 years ago, that has been applied, for example, in the analysis of countless very, very complex math models with many, many variables, in understanding in particular what is the map of the relationships between all the associated variables. So if you, for example, go through the article that I mentioned that we published, let's say, in the Journal of Happiness Studies in 2012 on the impact on various different dimensions of human experience on psychological well-being and what is the relative role of culture in this regard, what you see is that we can construct maps in which you don't simply measure the statistical significance, but what you show is what are the variables that talk to each other more closely. So what you understand in this case is that not only, let's say, music, let's imagine, can have an emotional impact, for example, on my mood regulation, but you can understand, for example, that music has this particular particularly relevant impact in this regard, for example, in a certain type of context. There can be, for example, a social relational context that is related to your free time, and that, for example, another form of cultural participation can be more impactful when you are in different conditions, like, for example, stress and responsibility related to your work environment. Just to make an example. So what we have to learn is exactly how to construct a very conditional picture of what is the impact of culture, not working for general clauses, everything, in some sense, everything works in terms of, let's say, imagining that the same context works in the same way for all possible kinds of experiences, for all possible kinds of people, and so on and so forth. So what AI can learn us to do is exactly to learn what is the situational grammar in which culture make the difference and in what specific capacity, acting through what specific mechanisms. So from this point of view, I am not saying that I want to, let's say, embrace a reductionist approach to culture, because of course culture is very multi-layered, and it's difficult to say, okay, this is simply the reason why culture is so important to humans. But the more we start to understand what are the actual pathways through which culture has an effect on what, and what are the actual, for example, contexts in which certain pathways are activated or not, we are starting to understand, as increasingly, for example, the European Commission is urging us to do, what it can be actually the role, for example, for certain types of cultural participation for social cohesion or for mental well-being, as in the case of the MESOC project itself. So we are at the verge of a new line of research, of a new line of work in which AI is not an option, it's a necessity. We simply don't have other tools today to carry out the level of complexity of analysis that we need in this particular regard without AI-based methods. So from this point of view, of course, by the way, you can also develop specific models that combine traditional AI mechanisms with, for example, evolutionary computation methods like, for example, variants of genetic algorithms to be able, for example, to prove what is the differential impact of a certain form, a certain variable, for example, related to cultural participation, keeping all the other constant, like in a partial derivative in the classical calculus. So you can really have very sophisticated ways to circumvent the traditional issues that you meet with traditional statistical analysis by using AI-based techniques. But this really needs a new toolkit. So my invitation from this point of view is to take very seriously the AI-based part of the toolkit that we are developing. Of course, one of the key issues, and then I'm going to conclude, one of the key issues is that today, the way in which a specific AI architecture acts in analyzing and in processing certain types of data is largely obscure to us, is still very much a cognitive black box. So one of the crucial issues for the future is also to develop models of explainable AI. So in particular, AI whose processing logic becomes transparent to humans and make us able to understand this. And this is even more important because in my talk, I basically related to AI in terms of computational methods to understand the impact of culture. But the point is that in the future, AI will be part of cultural production. We are moving towards hybrid ecosystems in which human and non-human players interact in creating content. So from this point of view, explainable AI is not simply important to understand better our measurement techniques, but also to understand better who will be the players of future cultural ecosystems. Thank you very much for your attention.